it's a family day out, not just a political day, although the Labour Party leader has spoke here several times. Every year, in fact, he comes.
The banners depict a lot of history of the lodges. They're steeped in tradition, sacrifices that have been made by people in the past, great sacrifices.
It goes back, I think, from the days before the wars, when people carried the battle flags in the battle, and the lodge's banner is seen as that way, as a battle flag.
Well, I think if you're employed at any workplace, is that if you've got a union, they're there to represent you and get the best conditions for you to enable you to enjoy your work rather than being in a slavery situation.
Well, I certainly think that unions have a very important part to play in industry. There are many large companies with large numbers of people employed, and while it might be nice to think that every manager knew every person and looked after his interests, I suppose in truth I would have to admit that's pretty unlikely, and it's natural enough to me that people in industry felt the need to form unions which should look after their interests.
I'm a union official. SOGAT, the union I work for, looks after the interests of men and women whose jobs concern paper and printing. In 1987, there were just under 10 million trade union members in Britain out of a population of 24 million in work. So about 2 in 5 workers belong to a union. Almost certainly, you have a close relative who belongs to one. A lot of my working life is spent talking to people. It might be at a committee meeting, or it might be at a paper factory, meeting the members and learning what they do, about their conditions at work, and their problems. After all, they voted for me, and they pay my salary.
Quantity of pulp and material waste.
Driver sits in this and
That's right.
goes up the
Once he's out of that safety area, then of course it becomes limited in its operation, and that it won't allow you to do certain things that are unsafe.
Obviously, all of our stock here is allocated, but I can say that we've got a making coming through.
So actually, it's ready yesterday.
Yeah, it would be coming into the warehouse this week, and
yes.
we're expecting 6 tons, so we could, get
right.
delivery for possibly Wednesday, possibly Saturday.
Because my members will only do well in a progressive, prosperous industry, I want to talk to the managers about how the business is doing. And there's also the public face of the unions.
I hold the view that the trades unions are the only organisations who can, and more importantly, who want to represent working women. The governments say they care. Sorry, I can't do the imitation. They say they care about 52% of the population who are women. They don't, and we know they don't.
If you take the last 150 or so years since the first workers came together to form unions, you have to agree we have become an established influence in what goes on in this country, despite our ups and downs. In 1926, for instance, at the end of the general strike, it seems that the whole idea of trade unionism had been smashed. And yet, less than 15 years later, in World War II, the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, was relying on a trade union leader, Ernest Bevin, at the T&GWU, to run industry to fight Nazi Germany on what he called the home front. Bevin took powers to control workers totally, so that he could send them wherever they could do most for the war effort. And he made strikes illegal, an unthinkable thing to do. On the other hand, he made sure that conditions improved, so that there were minimum wage rates, and that the unions still had powers to represent their members. And what's more, he introduced a daring new idea that there should be consultation between management and workers over the way individual plants would be run. All these things we in the unions would recognise as important goals today, and with the help of industry, management and labour, the war on the home front was won. But as victory came nearer, there was a new problem. After World War I, there had been a slump. There was no longer the demand for arms and military equipment. Millions of ex-servicemen came home to flood the job market. After World War II, politicians were quite determined they weren't going to let that happen again. So controls stayed, and the Labour government tried to sweeten the pill with a range of reforms. The birth of the welfare state, with a free health service, education and pensions was one. There was also nationalisation.
And so the mines passed into national ownership on the first day of the new year. And of course, this historic fact was duly celebrated at the pits. Though nationalisation is, of course, a long-term policy, January the 1st, 1947 was undoubtedly the day the miners had been waiting for.
Many of the newly nationalised industries, coal, steel, transport and so on, were headed by ex-union leaders, and the wartime contacts between unions and government stayed. But there were still strikes, particularly in the docks and mines. Troops, now with no one to fight, were brought in to help. So why more strikes now?
It was partly because the Labour government had to ask unions still to keep their belts tight. And with the TUC trying to tell their members that this was necessary, some members were not prepared to do it. For instance, many people in local factories in the West Midlands, where I came from, were feeling their muscles a little bit.
In 1950, the voters, many of them trade unionists, elected Mr. Churchill and the Conservatives to power.
I suppose a lot of people felt that even though they'd got jobs, that although they'd got, you know, the free health service coming through, they wanted some more in the pay packet, and they thought that a change in politics would help them.
The Conservatives, again like Labour, saw that the most effective way of managing economic growth was to work together with employers and trade unions. The National Economic Development Council was a body set up early in the 1960s to help management of the economy, and representatives of Labour and management both sat on it. During the 50s, there were relatively few big strikes, and union leaders found management and the government quite easy to reach agreement with. "You've never had it so good," was one Conservative Prime Minister's slogan. Gradually, though, as pressure for pay rises grew, the government and employers became nervous.
Much of the trouble we had in the 60s and the 70s was due to the very privileged position that the unions enjoyed under the law. Those privileges which gave them immunity from being acted against in courts of law were perhaps necessary in the very early days of this century. But as time went on, I think the unions came to abuse those privileges and to feel that they were above the law.
Whichever party was in power, Labour or Conservative, it was anxious to curb the unions. The press often billed the unions as greedy troublemakers, only too anxious to strike over the smallest grievance. New robber bands keen to hold the country to ransom, regardless of the national interests.
The trade union movement in Britain and in other democratic countries is a voluntary movement. Ordinary people coming together voluntarily to create their trade unions. They weren't invented by parties or governments or anybody else. It's a voluntary movement. And therefore the best form, indeed the only form of discipline within a voluntary movement is in fact self-discipline. And it is both impracticable and undesirable to seek to regulate by law voluntary organizations of this sort.
So, since that time, there have been two main themes in union history. One was the keenness by government of all sides to cut back on what they saw as the excessive power of the unions, not just when fighting for improved pay and conditions, but where critics would describe them as dabbling in politics. The other was inflation, rising wages chasing rising prices, which at last seemed to be bringing the post-war slump, only 20 years late.
I think the reason why early attempts to introduce some rule of law into industrial relations, the reason why the earliest attempt that I can remember, which was Barbara Castle and In Place of Strife, was that the Labour government felt it was necessary to get the unions' agreement before they passed the legislation. When it appeared that the unions were not going to agree voluntarily to this legislation, then the Labour government at the time, which I think I'm right in saying was headed by Harold Wilson, rapidly backtracked, so they didn't carry it through.
The TUC didn't like it, particularly as we were then in the process of discussing with the unions how we could improve industrial relations. We were in the process of discussing with the employers, the Confederation of British Industry, how we could jointly improve industrial relations. And then suddenly the Labour government came up with this set of propositions. So the TUC and unions reacted rather strongly against this.
In the end, the government withdrew the threats of legal enforcement and accepted a promise of restraint from the unions. But the problems weren't solved.
Well, it was a time of crisis in many different ways. The price of oil, for example, was going up, which inevitably led to some increase in prices. Then I think any employee, which included myself at the time, rather said to himself, well, this is too bad. We'd rather like to be insulated against this increase in the cost of living that is coming about partly through the increase in oil prices. So we applied to our employer for a wage increase because we wanted to be insulated from what was happening. Well, that was fine. Maybe the wage increase was then secured by strike action.
We weren't born yesterday. We knew that you couldn't, multiply by 4 to 5 times the price of oil and still expect to have the same standard of living as previously. In fact, we were arguing quite the reverse.
I think it is quite fair to say that we were not running ourselves as efficiently as, say, in those days the Germans or the Americans, let alone in latter days the Japanese. Now, I don't think that's because British managers were particularly foolish or stupid. I really do think it is because they had to spend so much of their time dealing with the unions, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, dealing with the unions on the shop floor with shop stewards, when they really ought to have been planning new machinery or finding new customers.
If men and women can't reach agreement with an employer, they can say, we won't work for you until there is an agreement. And to me, this is one of the marks of a democracy. The right of men and women not to go to work. All right, not to get any pay as a result, but the right not to go to work. Instead of having somebody hold a gun to their head and saying, you jolly well will work, no matter what wages I choose to pay you or what conditions I impose on you, you don't have the option of not working. And that's a big difference to me between a democracy and a dictatorship. Having said that, of course, one should always exercise it carefully, judiciously.
Then we had a Conservative government which passed the 1971 Industrial Relations Act, which I think suffered from being much, much too complicated and legalistic. When I say legalistic, I mean in fine detail, so that there was all sorts of scope for argument about whether this, that, or the other was legal or whether it wasn't. And it led to a lot of court cases, and this really was not beneficial at all.
There were huge union demonstrations and unofficial strikes. Most, in fact, arose from different problems. There was no kind of conscious connection between them. The dockers, particularly in London, protested about the move towards container traffic. Containers were unloaded by machinery straight onto the lorries, and dockers were no longer involved in the work. 5 of the strike leaders were sent to Pentonville prison under the Act. When the unions tested it on appeal, the government backed down, and the Pentonville 5 were released. Propaganda battle was important. Both sides needed to be seen representing democracy and the best interests of ordinary people. In 1976, Grunwick, a firm processing photographs, refused to employ union members and ignored ACAS, the arbitration body, set up by the government itself, which had ruled that Grunwick had no right to do this.
Until and unless this factory recognises the basic right of any man or woman to join the trades union of their choice and to afford recognition to that union.
Thousands of pickets, the vast majority not Grunwick workers or members of the union involved, turned up to show their sympathy and confronted police guarding the factory. The government did nothing to support the ACAS ruling, and to many union supporters, it seemed that direct industrial action was now their only effective weapon. In fact, all these confrontations were only one side of union activity during the 70s. They were anxious, as were many in the Labour and Conservative governments, to improve social conditions. A whole series of committees and commissions were set up with representatives from the unions and management. NEDC was already there, but now there was the Commission for Racial Equality, the Manpower Services Commission, the Health and Safety Commission, and the Equal Opportunities Commission. In 1975, Parliament passed the Equal Pay Act, something the unions had been pressing for almost 100 years. Throughout the 70s, unemployment rose and inflation stayed high, and government and managers seemed unable to turn the economy around. Yet at the same time, trade union negotiators were working on deals which meant that unions pledged greater productivity to go with better working conditions and pensions, none of which would have substantially increased inflation. In fact, inflation in the summer of 1975 stood at 28%. 3 years later, it was down to 8%. Nonetheless, unions were a very useful scapegoat for some in government and the media. Up until 1978, many public employees accepted wages that were well behind the inflation rate and what private employers were giving their staff. One group of civil servants after another found negotiation impossible and struck.
As the piles of dirty linen grow at one of Manchester's biggest hospitals, officials warn some could be closed within the week. The stench of this foul linen, much of which has been here since last Friday, is now obvious to anyone who passes by. And had it not been for the very cold weather, it would have been totally unacceptable by now.
Well, I'm sure that when the election came, I think it was in May 1979, after that winter of discontent, people still were feeling the bruises of that, and they were saying to themselves, well, here's a new government, a new prime minister, a different outlook. We've really had quite enough of what we suffered from. I wouldn't say it was all their fault, but what we suffered under the Labour government that ran from 1974 to 1979. I mean, we've just had enough of it.
Workers were aware of problems in the economy and often cooperated in change, but despite this, there were three major clashes in the 1980s. In the steel industry in 1980, in the coal mines in 1984, and then one in which I was involved in 1986 by a large print operator who changed the way his publications were produced. Many of you will have seen the pictures. They show the determination on one side to protect the new printing plant at Wapping, and the frustration on the other at being shut out of what union members saw as their jobs. But what the pictures didn't make clear was the background, the hours of negotiation, and the arguments on each side, the determination of the government and management to curb what they saw as too much power used by the unions for selfish, even political ends. And the determination by us in the unions to stand up for working people at a time when big business gets bigger and more impersonal, and when unemployment is far too high. Prosperity and fair play will only come about in a sensible partnership between management and Labour. But there have always been faults on both sides, and aren't those faults the result of our past history, as we've seen in this programme?
Right, so that would be for good quality letterheads or envelopes or that sort of thing. You worked here a long time?
16 months I've been here.
Oh, you're the shortest. Everyone I've spoken to has been here since they left school. If they're young, 4 or 5 years. Or, you know, all their working lives. Right. Have to get them clear windows, Roy, so they can have a much better view than they've got. They're much happier. Where's the music?
Oh, you can't hear it very well because of the machinery, you see, the cutter. Oh, you ain't got no pleasure, dear, I can tell you that.
I don't believe that.
That's true.
I don't believe that, woman. There's no pleasure, dear. Are you in the company pension fund?
No, no.
You're not?
No, I didn't. It was a bit late for me. So I didn't bother.
You should have done, you know. I mean, it's one of the things we press our members to do. It's important you get in the pension fund. What about the young girls? Are they in it?
They are. Oh, yes, all the others are.
So what are you going to do when you retire? It's a shame you're not in the pension fund. Anyway, I wish you well when you do retire.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you'd like an order form for the notes that accompany this series, please contact BBC Education Information on 081 746 1111. Now on BBC Two, Teaching Today discusses a variety of strategies